Maya Ortiz had been curator of the Cutter County Military Heritage Museum for 11 days, and she had already drawn a red line through half the floor plan. This whole case, she said, tapping the glass with one finger, comes down by Friday. We need the wall space for the interactive timeline. The case held a single black and white photograph, 6 soldiers in muddy fatigues, faces streaked with exhaustion, somewhere in a jungle clearing, and beneath it, a small bronze medal on a faded ribbon, displayed with no name card at all. Just a typed label, yellow with age. Donated 1994, origin unknown. It's been there since before I started, said Walt, the overnight custodian, not looking up from the floor he was mopping. He was 60-something, gray at the temples, built like a man who'd done physical work his whole life and never minded it. Whole case has been there since before the museum had a real roof. Which is exactly the problem, Maya said. She'd taken this job to modernize a place that hadn't changed a light fixture since the Clinton administration, and she meant to do it fast. Half our displays are origin unknown. We can't build an education program around mystery objects. If nobody can tell me who these men are, the case doesn't earn its wall space. I'm sorry, I know it's probably been here a long time, but a museum that doesn't change is just a storage unit with a gift shop. Fair enough, Walt said and kept mopping. At a folding table near the entrance, a girl of about 11 sat doing math homework, the museum's quiet after hours, her usual study spot while her dad finished his rounds. She glanced up at the case, then at her father, the way kids do when they've noticed something 100 times without ever asking about it. Dad always wipes that one down twice, Junie said, mostly to herself, even when it's already clean. Walt's mop kept moving, slow and even. Force of habit, he said. Habit of what? Just a habit. He didn't look at the case. He never looked at the case when other people were looking at it. Maya didn't catch the small exchange. She was already 3 displays down, talking into her phone about loading docks and shipping crates. The old case as good as gone in her mind before she'd even finished the sentence about it. The historian arrived 3 days later, a stooped, careful man named Arthur Pell, who'd spent 40 years cataloging donated military artifacts for a regional veterans foundation sent at the state's expense to do a final inventory before the museum's reopening. He looked, Maya thought, exactly like a man who'd spent 40 years in archive rooms, squinting at labels, double-checking dates, the kind of person who got genuinely excited about a poorly filled-out form. You said you had unidentified items, Pell said, setting a worn leather satchel down on the front desk with the care of a man unloading something fragile. I love unidentified items. Half my job, for 40 years, has been making them identified. The other half is admitting when I can't. Maya walked him through the museum floor, the uniforms, the maps, the rifles behind glass, narrating her renovation plans as they went, the displays she was keeping, the ones she'd already marked for the loading dock. When they reached the case with the photograph and the unlabeled medal, she gestured at it almost in passing. This one's on the list, she said. 6 soldiers, no names, medal with no provenance beyond a donation date. I was going to photograph it for the archive and let it go. Pell stopped walking. He leaned in close to the glass, adjusted his glasses, and went very still. The kind of stillness Maya hadn't seen from him in the half hour she'd known him. A man who'd been chatty and quick, suddenly gone quiet. Where did this medal come from? He asked, without looking away from the case. Anonymous donation, 1994, Maya said. No paperwork beyond the date. We tried tracing it years ago, apparently, and gave up. And the photograph, was it donated with it? Same lot? Same lot, same year. Why? Pell didn't answer right away. He set the satchel on a nearby bench, opened it with hands that had gone slightly unsteady, and pulled out a thin folder of photocopied pages, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. He laid one sheet beside the case. It was a grainy reproduction of the same image. 6 men, same jungle clearing, same exhausted faces, but with names typed in a column beneath it, 5 of them followed by dates. The 6th name had no date after it, just 2 words, typed in the same flat government font. Status unknown. This platoon went through a firefight in the Central Highlands in the spring of '71, Pell said, his voice quieter now, almost careful, like he was handling the words the same way he'd handled the folder. 5 men in this photograph didn't make it home. I've spent a good part of my career trying to fill in the 6th line on 100 photographs like this one. Soldiers who went missing during evacuation, whose units got scattered. whose paperwork never caught up to where they actually ended up. He tapped the second man from the left. Younger than the others, jaw set, eyes fixed on something past the camera that the photograph couldn't show. This man was listed as missing for 11 months before he turned up, alive, in a field hospital 2 provinces away. By the time anyone cross-referenced it, his unit had already been folded into another command. Half his old paperwork was lost in a records fire, and the file just stopped. Nobody updated it. He came home, and on paper, he just disappeared. Happens more than you'd think. Happened to a lot of men that year. Maya looked at the photo, then at the metal beneath it. Small, plain. The bronze gone dull with age, but the edges still sharp, like it had been handled often, carefully, by someone who knew exactly what it was. That medal, Pell said, is a Bronze Star. The citation describes a man pulling wounded soldiers out of an ambush position under direct fire. Twice. According to the original report, though only one act was ever formally cited, because the witness who could confirm the second one didn't survive the week. If this medal was donated anonymously, locally, in 1994, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maya looked down the hallway, toward the sound of a mop bucket being wheeled into the supply closet, slow and unhurried. The same sound she'd heard every night for 11 days without ever once connecting it to anything. He's not local, she said slowly, more to herself than to Pell. He's the custodian. He's worked here longer than the museum's had a real roof. He's the one who, she stopped. He wipes that case down, every shift. Twice, she found Walt in the supply closet, coiling a hose with the same unhurried care he did everything with. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face told her, before she'd said a word, that he already knew exactly why she was there. Walt, Maya said, can I ask you something? And I need you to actually answer it this time. He looked at her for a long moment. Not afraid. Just a man who'd been waiting 11 days, or maybe 11 years, for someone to finally ask the right question, and wasn't sure, even now, whether he was ready for the asking. That photograph, Maya said. The second man from the left. Is that you? The hose stopped moving in his hands. For a long moment, Walt didn't say anything at all, and Maya found herself holding her breath the way you do when you've stumbled onto something that isn't yours to rush, something that's been kept quiet on purpose for a long time by someone who had his reasons. I was 22, Walt said finally, setting the hose down carefully like it had gotten heavier in his hands. Best friends I ever had in that picture. 3 of them didn't make it past that week, and a 4th went not long after. Different reasons, but it counts the same to me. He glanced toward the hallway, toward the case, somewhere out of sight but never out of mind. I came home 11 months later than everybody figured I would, and by then there wasn't much fuss made over any of it. Different time, different welcome for men coming back from over there. I got a job, got married for a while, had Junie's mom, and then just Junie. Never saw much reason to make noise about a war most people back home didn't want to hear about, especially once it was old news. And the medal? Mine. Citation came through a couple years after I got back. Slow, the way everything was slow back then. I kept it in a drawer for 20 years. Then this place opened, and I figured, I don't know. Figured it ought to be somewhere people could see it, even if they didn't know whose it was. Didn't put my name on it, because it felt like it belonged to all 6 of us in that picture. Not just the one who happened to walk back out. Figured it'd sit there quiet, the way they did. Maya looked at the photograph again, 5 names with dates, 1 without. And then at the man standing in front of her in a gray work shirt with a mop bucket at his feet, who had spent every overnight shift for years, wiping down a glass case that held his own medal, and the faces of the men he'd never stopped carrying. I almost threw this away, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. I stood right there and called it clutter. You didn't know, Walt said. There was no edge in it at all, just the flat, settled tone of a man who'd long since stopped expecting anyone to know. Most people don't. That's sort of the point of how I set it up. It shouldn't have been the point, Maya said. Not anymore. The dedication was set for 6 weeks out, time to the museum's grand reopening, and by the morning of the ceremony, the case that had nearly gone into a shipping crate sat at the center of the main floor under new lighting, the old glass replaced, the yellowed origin unknown. Label gone for good. In its place was a new plaque, brass and freshly cut, listing all 6 names, 5 with dates beside them, and the 6th, with a service record that Pell had spent 5 weeks chasing down through 3 different archives. 2 records offices, and one very persistent phone call to a federal storage facility in St. Louis. Above the 6 names in smaller text ran a line Maya had insisted on, over Walt's quiet objection that it made too much of things. Metal donated anonymously by the 6th man, Walter Hale, 1994, formally credited, way 2026, on behalf of all 6. Junie stood in front of the case in a dress she'd clearly picked out for the occasion, reading the plaque slowly, the way she read things that mattered, mouthing the words to herself before she said them out loud. "Dad," she said, looking up at him, and then back at the wall. That's your name on the wall, in the museum. It's been here this whole time, and it's your name." "Looks that way," Walt said. His voice was steady, but Maya, standing a few feet back, in front of a small crowd that had turned out for the reopening, half of them regulars who'd walked past that case 100 times without a second look, saw his hand find his daughter's shoulder the way it probably had 1,000 times before, except this time his eyes were bright in a way she hadn't seen from him in 11 days of watching him mop the same floors, quiet and unremarkable, every single night. When Maya stepped up to the podium, she set aside the notes she'd written about renovation timelines and the new interactive wing, and talked instead about a case she'd almost dismantled, a man she'd almost overlooked entirely, and a metal that had been quietly polished twice a shift for years by the only person in the building who'd known what it really was. 11 days ago, I came in ready to clear out what I thought was clutter, she told the room. I had a checklist. This case was on it. What I found instead, when someone finally looked closely enough, was the most important thing in this entire building. And it had been here the whole time, mopping the floors after we all went home. She turned to Walt, and the room turned with her. "The boards voted, unanimously, this morning. We'd like you to co-curate this exhibit, officially, with your name on the door, if you'll have it. Not because of what you did 55 years ago, though that's part of it. Because of what you've been quietly doing every night since this building opened." And never once mentioned. Walt looked at the case, at 5 names that had waited 55 years to be spoken aloud in a room full of people who'd come specifically to hear them, and one name that had waited just as long to be spoken at all by anyone, including himself. "I'd like that," he said, and his voice didn't shake, though it came close. "They'd have liked that too, I think. All of them. They were better men than the world ever got to find out." Junie slipped her hand into his, the way she had 1,000 times crossing parking lots and waiting for buses. Except this time neither of them moved for a long moment. Together they stood in front of the case, father and daughter, in a museum that had nearly thrown away the truest thing it owned, while behind them, the room that had walked past him for years without a second glance began finally to applaud. Not for a ghost on a wall, and not for a story that had finally been pieced together by an old folder and a careful man's instincts. For the man who had carried 5 names home in his memory every single night for 55 years, polished a metal that wasn't even labeled as his, and had never once asked anyone, not the museum, not the town, not even his own daughter, to notice.